What's up, everybody, and welcome to the 17th episode of our F750 CrewCab build series. In the previous episode, you watched us install our front axle and mount some wheels and tires, which means in today's episode, we are going to morph together a 6.7 Power Stroke gauge cluster with a 1976 F750 dash Beazle. I know that sounds crazy. This is kind of like the biggest question mark of this whole entire project. So, well, by the end of this, we will have a 6.7 Power Stroke gauge cluster nice and clean, installed into a dash Beazle. So there's nothing to it but to do it. Stay tuned. Alright, you guys, this is going to be probably the most difficult and intricate part of this whole entire truck. Essentially, we need to break the 2016 Super Duty gauge cluster down. Which we already kind of have. There's a plastic piece that goes over this. This guy just pops off, and then the board with all the computerized items are up underneath this, right there. So essentially, we have to take this information right here and somehow stick it into the 1976 F750 gauge cluster. Now, obviously, that's not going to work because it's not blank. There's just a bunch of holes everywhere. So what we had to do was we had to go out and buy a gauge cluster. There's a little template of everything around there. We had to go out and buy another gauge cluster. This one is from Muncie Speed. They build things for F100s. They build things for C10s and things like that out of carbon fiber. This one's obviously not carbon fiber, but it was a blank canvas. We already started punching some holes that you guys will see right after this that we start at Kyle's shop. We're in my garage right now. But essentially we need a blank canvas. That way we could transfer over this template right here. Put it in place where we need it. Cut out the holes. And then that way these holes that are visible will essentially allow these gauges to be visible up through the holes. Now, this guy is a hair bit bigger than the gauge cluster itself, but there is some areas that we can kind of cheat it up and down in order to compensate for that. For example, these gauges up here, your fuel gauge, your temperature gauges, things like that. We don't need it to go all the way to the top up here. We only need it to be visible right there, right past that little arch where the needle pivots on, or not pivots on, but pivots, yeah, I guess pivots on. That way you can see kind of what you're at gauge-wise. So we really only need it past here. And then on the bottom, we don't need any of this. We don't need any of this. Now, yes, that's mounting brackets for the Super Duty, but we don't need that anymore. So if you look up underneath it, we can actually cut it off. We can't go past this outer frame because that protects the motherboard up underneath it. So we do need that. So essentially, we have all the way from, if you look at what gear you're in, you can kind of see it, park, rear, neutral, drive. We need it to be visible up underneath those letters. This doesn't matter down here. This doesn't matter because obviously that needle doesn't pivot all the way and rotate down past these 2 points right here and right here and right here and right here. So we just need it past that right there. And when you take that measurement to that measurement, we are actually insanely close with getting it fitted into this gauge cluster. Now, another issue that we have is this is extremely flat of a gauge cluster. This wasn't. And the top contoured to the 2016 Super Duty dash. But what does angle down a hair bit is the factory placement of the dash in the 1976 F750. So we are going to have to compensate for that. Another thing is we can't just stick the gauges through these holes because nothing covers it. And we need a little bit of a space and a gap between the dash cluster and the actual gauge itself. So what we're going to have to do, and the purpose of this video, is we are going to get measurements and figure out how much of a step off of this we need in order for those gauge needles to be able to pivot. And what we're going to do is we're actually going to 3D print tiny little spacers and that way they can fit all the way around the dash cluster. And then another thing we're going to do is we started cutting these out. Obviously they're not even. They are circular, but they're not even, if you can look up there on that crease. So I have a, gosh, what is it? Oh, a step drill. So we'll drill these out some more, get them in the exact same location. They're pretty dang close. And then what we're going to do is we're going to 3D a top trim and a bottom trim. So what that's going to do is, once the gauge cluster is in place, we're going to have a top piece and a bottom piece that kind of locks it in place with a little hex screw on the back. That'll also, here, I'll just use this for an example. It'll look similar to this outer ring. So imagine this guy right here. We'll 3D print it. Now these are just punched in. The back side, there's nothing there. They're just part of the actual dash cluster itself. We can't do that. We're not a machine shop. This isn't coming from a Ford plant. So what we have to do is we're going to essentially 3D print pretty much like this piece, but another one for the bottom, and that will be screwed together and clamp this in, and we'll have a really nice finish. Almost looks like factory finish when we're done. We'll do that for these, and we'll also do that for everything else. The square in the middle for your numbering and your letters, and then also for our speedometer and our RPMs, our tack. So we'll have an inner and an outer for all of it. So I think that'll help it look really clean. It'll kind of serve two purposes. It'll also give us the distance that we need between the needles and the gauges and the dash cluster itself. So that's what I'm going to start on today. We're going to really just line this out, get this in place, and start getting measurements to 3D print everything. And well, we'll start 3D printing. Okay, you guys, that took a little bit longer than anticipated. I went and got a brand new hole saw to meet the diameter requirements we needed, and it had a little bit of issues going through this. Why can't I think of the material right now? Oh my gosh, I'm spacing it. You guys probably know exactly what it is. I know how it gets applied. It gets applied on, oh, fiberglass. There we go. Fiberglass. Okay, cool. So I'm not crazy. Anyway, got the holes cut out. Now there is a tiny little square right here. I am going to drill out the corners, but I'm not going to cut it out or anything. We can still get the measurements because it's a square for the trim piece that goes around. But I don't really need it cut out right now. I'm going to go get a jam saw, and that way I can just kind of cut it out really accurately and things like that. One nice thing about putting trim around all of this is this fiberglass was getting eaten up by the bit. Same thing happened to here, and we used actually a different hole saw technique, and but it just kept getting eaten up. But the nice thing about having that little kind of trim piece that goes around everything is all of this will be hidden. So our holes don't need to be accurate, or they do need to be accurate, but they don't need to be perfect in the sense of perfectly clean. Some chips are okay. As you can tell, this one's a little off, and as far as I know, these two are good to go. Even if they're off a little bit, there's enough room so that way when we put the trim piece in, we can move it front, back, left, right, you know, diagonal in order to make it square with this one, make everything even. But that's what it looks like right now. I'm going to toss the 2016 gauge cluster up underneath, start getting some measurements, and this thing's actually going to be knocked out relatively soon. Hopefully. Then we can jump on the 3D printer and start printing off some spacers and some, I guess you could call it like bezels, I guess. Maybe? Who knows? Okay, let's get to it. Well, here it is so far, you guys, a little update. I do have all the measurements over here. What I did was I got a measurement of the inside to inside and outside to outside of the bezel from the factory 2016 truck. Obviously, this one was designed by probably a ton of engineers from Ford specifically for this gauge instrument right here. So I figured that was a pretty safe bet on where to measure to. I will cut out this middle later down the road because we don't really need it right now. I do have measurements for this to 3D print the bezels that will go around. Sorry, I just moved this so it kind of went off kiltered. Now, one thing we have to do is, it looks like we could just put it up like this, put all the needles in, and it would be fine. But it's actually not how it works. In order for these holes to be centered, this has to be almost on top of the other needles. I know that sounds really dumb, but I'll show you the reason why right here. If you look back here, see how those are notched out? That's where these guys sit. They sit up underneath, just like, turn it to the side for you guys, just like, come on fingers, this sits in that pocket. So the reason why we can't just toss this on is because nothing would line up. These two would either be too low for those four to be centered, or these two have to go up for these for everything to be centered, which is what we have to do. These have to move up, they'll be centered, those will be centered when you look down them, and those needles just get covered up a little bit. That's just the way Ford designed them. So what we have to do is we essentially have to 3D print this spacer right here, right around here, and have them behind each one of those. That'll also raise the rest of the dash bezel up a little bit, and so we can't just put it on the back or else it'll be angled like this. So what we have to do is I'm going to 3D print some little spacers that will go around everywhere up underneath it that we can drill a hole through and screw it from here into the hardware itself, and I think that'll work. I think that'll look really nice, and I think that's the route we have to go in order to make this properly spaced up. Now it looks dumb right here just because you look down it, but that looks good. Sorry, I can't get directly above it to show you guys exactly. Now the second thing you might notice is, what the heck's with this, right? Looks dumb, it's protruding past here. Well, these will be cut off right here and right here. However, there will be a little bit of black and white up underneath it showing. Now, will that cause an issue? No, because the way it sits in the truck and on the F750 dashboard is, yes, it screws into this, but this keeps going down further because there's a little bit of a lip right here on the dashboard. So from our calculations and our measurements and our rough fitting, this will essentially just fit right behind that lip perfectly. Now it's leaning on it right now. Right now it's tied up on it. When we add a spacer, it'll kind of like that, right? When we add a spacer, it'll increase the height of it, which will give it even more room to go up underneath that trim, if that makes sense. So that's what we're running with right now. We'll have to cut this out, and I think I need to get my jam saw in order to do it after I drill 4 holes. Like I said, it doesn't have to be perfect because we're going to be putting trim around all 7 of these openings. But I guess the big question is, well, I guess it looks pretty cool. I was thinking about putting maybe some air vents on each side of this, so That way I have some air coming on to me as I drive it. I don't know, maybe I'll just leave them be, because the factory one, let me see if it's in here. Nope, where'd I put that? Anyways, the factory one has other things to the right and left. I was thinking maybe speakers, or we just keep it really clean, really simple, and leave it like that. Alright you guys, I just finished the last cut, the center cutout. Man, I keep messing that up every time I move it. Anyways, that's pretty much what it's going to look like at the end of the day. Like I said, we're going to 3D print some bezels around the whole thing, and it should be able to really clean up these edges really well. Now obviously these aren't 100% straight. Obviously I need to clean up some areas right there and right there in this other corner. I'm cutting off as minimal as possible for right now. I can always trim it back if I need to, but I want to wait until we have the bezels printed and do kind of like a test fit on everything first to see what I need to trim and what I don't need to trim. So everyone in the comment section, I know this isn't a perfect square. Trust me, I know the bezel will square everything up, the bezel will make everything a perfect circle, so I'm not too concerned about any of those things, but for what it's worth, I think it looks pretty dang sweet. The 3D printer has finished printing, and this is our end result. Now, full disclaimer, I thought I was going to be able to do this myself, and it turned out to be a much more difficult process and project than I initially anticipated. So what I did was I reached out to a guy that does 3D printing as like a side hustle and hobby, and he knocked this out of the park. He killed it. He actually told me this was like 47 attempts to try to figure this out to get it to fit properly for our application. So I'm going to give you guys a quick little rundown on what this is. I know I've kind of talked about it earlier in the video and kind of what our goal was, but now that it's here physically in person, I'm going to tell you guys exactly how it works. So essentially these pieces come off from the bottom piece, which is a spacer. So I'm going to remove it now. Toss them to the side, all these 4 pieces, and what is left is with the bottom piece of our gauge cluster bezel, is what I call it, essentially kind of like an outskirt, inner and upper for the dash cluster. So I'm going to grab that now. So this is our 6-7 gauge cluster right here. So what I need to do was we need to print a spacer for that guy to sit on top. So this essentially sits right here. Now, it's not going to fit perfectly right now because I have to obviously adjust it, but for the sake of an update video, go with the flow, please. So this sits here. I need to glue it to the dash cluster somehow, because we can't have bolts going through it, because on the back side is all of the computerized information, I guess motherboard, I guess you could call it, information that we need that runs this. So we can't go through it, so I have to essentially glue it on there where it sits. So it's going to sit like that, and this guy is going to come up on top and sit just like that. Boom. So we come in with our top piece of our bezel, and it's going to come in and sit in those holes, as well as all 4 of these little guys right here. Now I'm not putting this in 100%. That's one of 2 reasons why. First reason, obviously I'm doing this for an update video. And second reason is they don't actually fit yet. So that's essentially what it's going to look like by screwing these in with these little hex bolts. These ones will go in the 4. It'll go through here and attach into these, which are 3D printed in. So those are the bigger ones. Then there's also a bunch of smaller ones. Let me grab them. There's smaller little hex bolts that will go all around each of these outer bezels and attach to the inner bezel. And that will essentially clamp this dash bezel together with the bottom plate, the spacer. So these each have 3, these have 4, there's a couple around there. They'll clamp it together, fasten it together, and then essentially when it's attached to this, this will be glued to the gauge cluster and have everything seamlessly one piece. That is the end goal. So another reason why it doesn't fit perfectly right now is I need to actually come through with a Dremel tool, and I'm going to remove these first. I need to come in with a Dremel tool and essentially clean up all these holes. I went off of some nice Scotch painter's tape when I did this. Tanner, who did the 3D printing, he went off of the original piece that went onto this gauge cluster. I don't know if you guys remember it. It essentially looked like this. It rounded up. There's a clear piece that went across, and that sat in the dashboard. So he went off the original, which is better because those are accurate measurements from Ford's engineering. So he went off that. So essentially I need to go off of his product now and make all these holes nice and clean with a Dremel tool and get them perfect so that way all of these fit in where they need to go. So I don't have a Dremel tool on me. I need to go to Home Depot, grab a tool, grab some bits for it, start cleaning this out so that way we can fasten everything together and have a complete 1976 dash bezel and cluster, or not really cluster, a dash bezel with a 2016 6.7 Power Stroke dash cluster. Alright, an update for you guys. I think I have everything in place. I did have to go get a little Dremel tool. I know Dremel's the brand. I don't know what these are called. I just call them Dremels. Anyways, I did have to sand out a little bit, as you guys saw. And a little bit turned out to be a ton. Look at all that dust. Anyways, I do believe it fits relatively well. Of course, I moved it, so that's not going to help. Anyways, there is a little bit of wiggle room side to side. You can't really tell, but I can feel it right here. That will suction up and close the gap when I do put those hex screws in. Another thing I noticed that these pieces on each side, they have a little cup area that goes with the contour of the dash bezel. The center square does not have one. So what we're going to have to do is, this is just primed. It can be sanded. It can get some body filler and things like that. If there's scratches, it can get primed, painted, any finish I want. So there is a little bit of seam underneath that I kind of messed up on when I cut it. I did cut it a little bit over, but on each side right here and right here, you have to cut it enough to where it sits down in place, if that makes sense. So it does sit down in place. It just has a little bit of gap on the bottom. These get closed up once they get suctioned down and screwed off. So those will be fine. It's just right here and right here a little bit. So when we do some body filler and get it ready for primer and paint, I will kind of work up to the bezel. And I think that'll have a really good finish look. These all work really, really well. As you can tell, they're not fully circle, they're kind of half, just because where the gauge is, it goes into this lip coming up, so it can't be a full circle. It has to have sort of an abrupt edge right there that cuts off for this lip. But I'm super stoked with how it looks. Also, I haven't touched on this yet. The reason why these are brown is because that's actually tape on both sides. What Tanner did was he got a clear, not plastic, but a clear lens per se, that was the same material as the material he 3D printed out of. So what he did was he would first print half of this, half the bezel, and while it was still hot, he took the lens material and put it on top. And then on top of that, he would finish his printing process. And what that did was there's a coherent kind of bond between the lens and the gauge cluster, or the gauge bezel itself. So we do have clear lenses built into these, which I think is really awesome. So that way no debris, no dirt, dust, anything like that will fall onto the actual needles of the gauges. So up next, what I need to do is I did go get some not JB weld, but it was like a JB plastic weld. It's the same brand. What I need to do next is I now need to, well, first I need to clean everything off because this dust is starting to annoy me. I essentially need to glue it on there and see how it fits, get it properly in place, glue it so that way everything is firm, and then I can now add the dash bezel onto there and have everything good to go. So that's what I'm going to do up next. I'm going to place this where it needs to be. I do think these little nipples or tabs, whatever you want to call them, there's one right there, there's one right there, those do need to come off. That was for the original piece to kind of get centered. There's some here throughout there. It was just kind of like a secondary thing for it to be centered on there. We don't have that on here, so what I do need to do is I do need to kind of move it around in order to get this completely centered on the dash cluster. So that's what's up next. I'm going to clean everything up, start getting some measurements, start test fitting everything, and you guys will see that right up next. Alright you guys, I've sanded down the tabs, or the little nipples, whatever you want to call them, off of the gauge cluster, and I did run into a little bit of an issue. So I sanded them down real quick, no problem, but yet when I go to center the spacer, it's not centering properly like it should, or like I would prefer it to. I thought at first that these tabs or nipples were kind of preventing it from being centered. That's not really the case. I think this could be tweaked a little bit to fit better, but I think I'm going to run with it. So I'll give you guys a quick little rundown. You guys saw me center this as best as possible, right, left, top, and bottom. And I centered it on this middle square area because I feel like that's where your eye will be fixated the most. Now I know the speedometer is over here and you're going to be looking at that. I know you're going to be looking at the fuel gauge and things like that. But for the most part, when you just glance down, I feel like the center will draw your eye the most. So when I go to center it, let me just, roughly there, obviously I'm moving it. As you can tell, if you look down, there's a lot more space on the right-hand side than there's the left-hand side. Now this is obviously the opposite issue, more space on the left-hand side as there's the right-hand side. The top, I don't know if you guys remember me telling you about it. Early in the video, I said that these kind of sit back up underneath it, which that works perfectly. However, the two middle ones are perfect. But the right and the left-hand gauges are a little bit off, and they coincide with the bottom gauges, which is kind of an issue because obviously if you look down, the fuel gauge should be more to the left, and this guy should be more to the right. What that causes is kind of just an aesthetic issue. So these do turn all the way over just because of the way they're 3D printed. These work, and then these, the PSI can go all the way to the right as well, just because that's the way they're printed. So there's no issue besides a cosmetic. They're not straight on, which might drive me crazy. It might not. Same with these guys. They're not perfectly straight on. So the only difference or change that we could do is we could reprint this spacer, but then the issue that causes is I've already drilled these holes out. So these holes are meant for this spacer. So if I replace this spacer, now these holes are going to be off. I don't know if they're going to be off top and bottom, right and left. I don't know, but I just know that they're going to be off because that went off of this. So then I run into the issue. Do I reprint the spacer and buy a new Muncie Speed dash bezel, or do I just go with what I have now and then later down the road when I have extra time kind of update this whole entire process? The reason why I don't want to get a new one of these right now is because I think this was like $300-400, so it'd be kind of a kick in the nuts to have to buy a new one just to redo all this. I also don't want to reprint a new one of these because I think it fits pretty well, and I also don't want to wait a couple more weeks to have it done. So what I'm thinking is I'll assemble all of it, we'll get it installed in the truck, we'll run with it, and if this really bothers me a ton later down the road, I'll replace it. But for now, just to get the truck running and driving, this will work. Obviously, the gauges will still work. These still spin even though they're off-centered. Now, I did just move it. Even though they're off-centered, I have checked. There's no rubbing or anything like that. Same with this side. It does move. All of these gauges move. And the biggest and most important part is you see those lights? Obviously, they're not on because there's nothing hooked up. Anyways, there's like your high beam signals right there. Over here, you have your, I think, emergency brake, park brake, your traction control, I believe, is right there. Over here, you have all those bad boys. Those are all visible with how it sits, even though these are off a little bit. So I can still see all of the light ups and all the warning signals with this setup, which is kind of crucial and important when mocking this up. So the fact that I can see that none of the needles are hitting and it still can be centered visually, I think I'm just going to run with this. And like I said, later down the road, if it really, really bothers me, I will redo this whole setup and kind of take what I've learned here and run with it. But for now, and for the first attempt, I think this is a really solid game plan, and I think it's going to turn out really well. With that being said, now that I have this relatively centered, I can take this off, and I can grab my plastic weld, and I can mix it up. And what I'm essentially going to do is I'm going to flip it on the back side, and I'm going to essentially just apply it all around everything and stick it on here. Some of you might ask, well, if I'm gluing it onto here, then when I go to replace it, this is going to be damaged and no good. Yes and no. You can actually replace these. These pop up by these little tabs and nipples. Some people will replace them with like white ones. There's different colored ones. So by gluing to these, it doesn't really damage it. I would just have to replace these when I do this all over again, which isn't a huge issue. So that's the game plan right now. Gonna mix some things up, stick it to there, get everything assembled finally, and we'll see what a final result looks like here in a bit. Mixed it up, got the JB weld, put it on. This is kind of a stressful time just because it's like a one and done kind of thing. So what I did when I mixed it up is I put it on the outside of everything. So that way, I don't know if you can tell right here. That way when it gets squished by not this ammo box, when it gets squished down, it'll fill in on the inside, but then the majority of it, if it seeps out, will be on the outside. So I'm hoping that's how it's working. Now I have seen a couple of areas that there's a little bit of seeping on the inside. I can deal with that. I just don't want a ton of it like that. So that's why I put it on the outside. And hopefully, fingers crossed, this turns out, because like I said, it's just a one and done. This stuff, I don't know if you guys have ever worked with JB Weld for either plastic, metal, concrete, things like that. This stuff doesn't come apart. It's rated for like 4,300 PSI or something. Let me look. Oh, 3,900 PSI is the strength on that. So what I'm saying is, one shot, I'll never be able to tear this apart if it doesn't work out. So I'm going to let it set up for about 5 to 15 minutes. I might come back in 5 minutes, like the box says, and see if it's tacky. If it's still tacky, I'll take this off and see if there's any wiggle room, just in case I misaligned it somewhere. And if it's not, I'll just put the weight back on and let it set up for another 20-35 minutes. So I guess I will show you guys that when I'm done. And I guess you can't really see anything right now. It's like the old saying, I guess we'll watch paint dry. Alrighty, it's been about 15 minutes. I'm going to take these bad boys off. And it doesn't look too shabby. It is a little tacky to touch. But other than that, I'm just double checking to make sure the needles don't hit anywhere. I know I put these on as straight down as possible, but with it still being a little wet when I did put them on, it might have shifted it right and left, but it doesn't appear so. These still all turn. My biggest fear was some of the glue spreading out in these smaller gauges and then hitting these needles and pretty much sticking these needles where they're at. So they all move freely, which is good. So I do have a little bit of not overhang, but a little bit of seeping here and there, which isn't terrible. Then also here as well. But overall, it's not bad. I would be kind of annoyed if it got past the, well, whatever that is, the lines. But it looks like it stayed in there, which isn't a huge issue because once we put the outer bezel on, that stuff actually might be covered. So, sweet. I'm happy with that. It looks pretty centered. Looks pretty good. Now I can get going on getting the rest of it, the dash bezel, actually put on and see how the other half of the bezel sits on all these gauges and see what it looks like. But I might let it dry up for a little bit longer just because it is tacky and I don't want to gouge it. I just want to kind of let it sit where it is. But sweet, it's not moving. Alright, you guys, it is finally assembled. That is the final product. Now, I still do have some hex nuts to put in, but for the most part, it's securely fastened. All of those are fastened in there. There are either 1 or 2 hex nuts in every single one of them. So that means there's either 1 or 2 missing out of every single one of them. I just needed enough to clamp it in there to kind of give you guys a representation of what it's going to look like. I didn't want to secure it too much just because everything now has to come off so we can sand, prime, and paint these. Sand, prime, and paint all the bezels as well. So I didn't want to assemble it too much just for the sake of having to disassemble it to paint it. So that's pretty much what it's going to look like. Now there are some spots here. I don't know if you can see them. Up underneath, there's a couple spots like I mentioned earlier. There's a spot right there and a spot right there looking down that I will need to fill when we do some body filler and stuff like that to prep it for paint. But besides that, all of these look really good. Majority of this looks really good. Now, like I mentioned earlier, these will be cut off here and there, and then this is all going to be tucked behind the actual dashboard, the metal dashboard, so it'll look really clean once it's in there. But essentially that's going to be what it looks like looking down at the gauge cluster. That's a 2016 6.7 power stroke gauge cluster with the surround bezel of a 1976. Now it does look different just because I mentioned earlier the bigger trucks do have the bump side interiors, so this isn't an actual like F250, F350, F100 dent side bezel and dash, just because it's different. So don't at me in the comments saying I misspoke. This is a bump side dashboard and dash bezel. So that's the final product. I think it looks awesome. I'm not going to tear these off until everything's painted, but I don't know, you guys are going to have to let me know. I am stoked about this. We were able to actually swap over and make it a complete plug-and-play gauge cluster system for the truck. Alright you guys, that's going to be a wrap for today's episode. We officially have a 6.7 Power Stroke gauge cluster in a 1976 F750 CrewCab dash bezel. This allows us to essentially keep the plug-and-play system alive throughout this whole entire project. We've made sure and gone to extended lengths to make sure that we can keep this whole entire process a plug-and-play system, and this dash was kind of like the biggest question mark of this whole entire project. So I want to take a time to thank Tanner for designing this. It looks awesome. It was way past my capabilities, so Tanner, thank you for helping us out with this. We think it turned out awesome, and we're excited to essentially install it in the truck, see what it looks like with the rest of the dash and the factory interior, and we're stoked to keep the 1976 interior feel alive. So we appreciate you guys watching, and we'll see you on the next one.